At 3:30 on the morning of August 5th, 1962, a psychiatrist stood outside Marilyn Monroe's locked bedroom window in Brentwood, California. Inside, one of the most famous women in the world lay motionless on her bed, a telephone still within reach. Within hours, newspapers declared it a tragic suicide. The case appeared closed almost as quickly as it had begun. But then the questions started. Why did key witnesses remember that night differently? Why did investigators never fully agree on the timeline? Why did FBI files continue to mention Marilyn long after her death? And why, more than 60 years later, do newly released documents and first-hand accounts still keep one rumor alive that somewhere between Hollywood glamour and presidential power, Marilyn Monroe became part of a story that no one could completely control? Tonight, we're separating documented fact from decades of speculation, following the evidence from the brightest lights of Hollywood to the darkest mystery of Marilyn's life. Because sometimes the biggest secrets aren't hidden by what people say, but by what they never prove. Before we uncover what really happened, subscribe to The Gilded Cage for more true stories where fame, power, and history collide. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Before she met a president, she was fighting to escape her past long. Before she became the world's most recognizable blonde, she was a frightened little girl named Norma Jeane. She wasn't born into glamour. She wasn't raised among movie stars. She wasn't destined for fame. She was born on June 1, 1926, in Los Angeles, to a mother who struggled with severe mental illness and a father whose identity has never been established with certainty. Throughout her childhood, Norma Jeane moved between foster homes, family friends, and orphanages. Stability was something she saw in other people's lives, not her own. Years later, friends would notice something that followed her into adulthood. She desperately wanted to be loved, not admired, not photographed. Loved, that longing would shape nearly every important relationship she ever had. When the Second World War began, Norma Jeane took a job inspecting military equipment at the Radioplane factory in California. It was there in 1944 that an army photographer documenting women supporting the war effort noticed something unusual. The camera seemed drawn to her. She wasn't trying to become famous. She simply understood, almost instinctively, how to connect with a lens. Modeling offers soon followed. Her brown hair became blonde. Her name became Marilyn Monroe. The transformation appeared effortless. It wasn't. Hollywood in the late 1940s could be unforgiving, especially for young actresses. Studios controlled nearly every aspect of an actor's career, from appearance and publicity to the roles they were allowed to accept. Executives admired Marilyn's beauty, but doubted her intelligence. Some believed she would never become more than another glamorous supporting actress. They were wrong. Instead of accepting that judgment, Marilyn studied acting with remarkable determination. She attended classes under respected teachers, read novels and poetry between film shoots, and spent hours analyzing performances by some of the greatest actors of her generation. Visitors to her homes often found shelves filled with books by Fyodor Dostoevsky, Walt Whitman, Sigmund Freud, Thomas Wolfe, and playwrights whose work challenged audiences rather than entertained them. This side of Marilyn rarely appeared in magazine profiles. The public saw the smile. They rarely saw the student. As her career accelerated during the 1950s, films like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, How to Marry a Millionaire, The 7-Year Itch, and Some Like It Hot transformed her into an international phenomenon. Her face sold magazines across Europe. Her films broke box office records. Fashion designers copied her style. Photographers competed for a single portrait session. She had become more than an actress. She had become an idea. To millions, Marilyn Monroe represented beauty, confidence, romance, and success. Yet the people who knew her best often described someone very different. Actor Eli Wallach remembered her as thoughtful and surprisingly shy. Photographer Milton Greene saw a woman determined to build her own production company because she was tired of being treated as a commodity. Playwright Arthur Miller, who became her third husband, admired her curiosity and intelligence even as their marriage slowly came apart under the pressure of fame. The contrast between Marilyn's public image and her private reality continued to widen. By the end of the decade, success had brought wealth, but not peace. She endured chronic insomnia. She suffered from recurring health problems. Doctors prescribed medications to help her sleep, reduce anxiety, and manage physical pain, common medical practice at the time, though far less understood than it is today. She also became increasingly interested in politics. That surprised many people. Marilyn followed world events closely. She discussed elections with friends, admired leaders who projected confidence, and believed entertainers should not remain isolated from the issues shaping the country. Her friendships expanded beyond Hollywood studios to include journalists, writers, lawyers, and influential political donors. Without realizing it, she was drifting toward a social world where celebrities and politicians often met behind closed doors. Southern California in the late 1950s was remarkably interconnected. Film producers attended the same charity dinners as senators. Newspaper publishers hosted parties where governors mingled with actors. Palm Springs estates welcomed business leaders, entertainers, and rising political figures for weekends that rarely appeared in newspaper headlines. One man moved comfortably through all of those circles: Peter Lawford. A popular actor with effortless charm, Lawford possessed something almost no one else in Hollywood did. He was married to Patricia Kennedy, the sister of Senator John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Through Lawford, the worlds of Hollywood glamour and Washington power became surprisingly close. Guests who accepted invitations to his home might spend one evening discussing a new film with Frank Sinatra. The next, they could find themselves talking politics with members of one of America's most influential families. Marilyn Monroe entered that circle at exactly the moment John F. Kennedy's political career was reaching extraordinary heights. Kennedy was young, confident. Television loved him. Voters admired him. To many Americans, he represented the future. Marilyn represented something equally powerful: the American dream manufactured by Hollywood. Neither could have known that history would forever connect their names. What began as overlapping social circles would eventually become one of the most debated relationships of the 20th century. But before whispers turned into headlines, before rumors became legends, there was a series of private gatherings where some of the most famous people in America believed no one outside the room would ever know what happened. They were wrong. When John F. Kennedy became the 35th President of the United States in January 1961, he wasn't simply entering the White House. He was becoming America's first true television president, young, photogenic, quick with a smile. His administration projected energy at a time when the Cold War cast a long shadow over the country. To millions of Americans, Kennedy represented hope. To Washington insiders, he represented power. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away, Marilyn Monroe had become something equally extraordinary. She wasn't just Hollywood's biggest star. She was one of the most recognizable women on Earth. On the surface, their worlds couldn't have been more different. One was built on politics, the other on cinema. But behind the scenes, those worlds overlapped far more than most Americans realized. Hollywood's elite frequently socialized with politicians, wealthy businessmen, newspaper publishers, and major Democratic donors. Exclusive homes in Palm Springs, Beverly Hills, and Santa Monica hosted weekend gatherings where famous actors might find themselves seated beside senators, judges, or cabinet officials. One address appeared again and again in eyewitness accounts: Peter Lawford's Beach House. Lawford was much more than a successful actor. He was married to Patricia Kennedy, the president's sister. That relationship placed him in a unique position. He could invite Hollywood royalty and members of America's most powerful political family to the same dinner table without anyone thinking it unusual. Guests later described evenings filled with music, drinks, laughter, and conversation that drifted effortlessly between films and foreign policy. For those inside the room, it felt perfectly natural. For historians looking back, those gatherings became critically important because they created the opportunity for Marilyn Monroe and John F. Kennedy to know each other away from cameras and reporters. Exactly when they first met remains uncertain. Some biographers suggest their first introduction occurred several years before Kennedy entered the White House. Others believe they became acquainted only after he won the presidency. No photograph has surfaced showing their very first meeting. No diary records the exact date. Instead, historians rely on overlapping recollections from people who attended those private parties. Those recollections don't always agree, but they point in the same direction. Marilyn had entered the Kennedy social circle, and the rumors began almost immediately. Hollywood gossip columnists heard whispers, political insiders heard them too, yet almost nothing appeared in major newspapers. That wasn't because journalists never learned about powerful men's private lives. It was because journalism worked differently in the early 1960s. Many editors believed a politician's personal relationships were irrelevant unless they directly affected public office. There was also an unwritten understanding between many reporters and the White House. Certain aspects of a president's private life simply weren't pursued as aggressively as they would be today. The result was remarkable. Some of the biggest stories in America remained little more than quiet conversations. Marilyn's name occasionally surfaced in those conversations, never loudly, never publicly, but often enough that people close to both worlds took notice. Then came one evening that changed everything. May 19th, 1962, Madison Square Garden. More than 15,000 guests filled the arena for a Democratic Party fundraising gala celebrating President Kennedy's upcoming birthday. The event featured politicians, entertainers, business leaders, and television cameras broadcasting one of the most glamorous evenings of the year. Marilyn arrived late. Even before she stepped onto the stage, photographers surged toward her. She wore a custom-made gown designed by Jean-Louis, covered with more than 2,000 hand-sewn crystals. The fabric matched her skin so closely that under the stage lights she appeared almost wrapped in glitter. The audience fell silent. She leaned toward the microphone. Then came the performance every generation since has recognized. "Happy birthday, Mr. President." The delivery was slow, playful, intimate. Some audience members laughed, others applauded. President Kennedy smiled from his seat. When Marilyn finished, the applause echoed through the arena. It lasted less than 2 minutes, yet those 2 minutes permanently linked their names. By the following morning, newspapers around the world carried photographs of the performance. Commentators debated whether the song had crossed the line between entertainment and flirtation. The public began asking a question historians are still trying to answer today. Was that chemistry simply part of Marilyn's performance, or was it revealing something real? The answer isn't as straightforward as popular culture often suggests, because once the cameras stopped recording, the evidence becomes much more difficult to separate from legend. If someone asked whether Marilyn Monroe and President Kennedy were secretly involved, the most honest historical answer would surprise many people. Probably, but not proven beyond doubt. That may sound unsatisfying. History often is. Unlike novels, real life rarely provides every missing page. Instead, historians work with fragments. Witnesses remember conversations. Government agencies preserve reports. Friends leave memoirs. Journalists keep notebooks. Years later, researchers try to fit those pieces together. Sometimes the picture becomes clear. Sometimes important sections remain missing forever. The Monroe-Kennedy story belongs firmly in that second category. One of the strongest arguments that some form of relationship existed comes from the sheer number of independent witnesses who later described seeing Marilyn and John Kennedy together in private settings. Their stories were rarely identical, but they shared striking similarities. Several recalled seeing Marilyn at gatherings attended by the president. Others remembered unusually private conversations between the two. Some believed the relationship was physical. Others thought it was little more than flirtation. What almost none of them described was a great romance. That image largely developed years later through books, films, and television dramatizations. Most serious Kennedy historians believe that if an affair occurred, it was brief. John F. Kennedy's personal life has been studied in extraordinary detail. Biographers have documented numerous romantic relationships outside his marriage to Jacqueline Kennedy. Former aides, Secret Service agents, and close associates painted the portrait of a president who often separated his public responsibilities from his private behavior. That context makes an encounter with Marilyn entirely plausible. But plausibility is not proof. Marilyn's own surviving papers offer surprisingly little certainty. She wrote letters. She kept notes. She discussed relationships with trusted friends. Yet no authenticated document has ever emerged in which she clearly describes a sustained affair with President Kennedy. That absence has encouraged two very different interpretations. One argues that sensitive material was deliberately destroyed. The other argues there was never much to destroy in the first place. Then there are the FBI files. Few documents have fueled more speculation. During the Cold War, the FBI monitored thousands of public figures whose friendships, travel, or political associations attracted official attention. Marilyn Monroe became one of them. Not because agents believed she was a spy, not because they accused her of a crime, but because several people within her social circle had previously drawn government scrutiny during the anti-communist investigations of the 1950s. The declassified files reveal surveillance, background reports, lists of acquaintances, summaries of information supplied by confidential sources. They also confirm something important. Federal authorities considered Marilyn noteworthy enough to watch. What they do not reveal is direct evidence that she threatened national security or maintained a documented secret relationship with President Kennedy. For conspiracy theorists, the files raised even more questions. For historians, they established a simpler fact: the government was paying attention. Nothing more. Nothing less. Another recurring claim centers on a notebook sometimes called Marilyn's Little Red Diary. According to later accounts, she allegedly recorded conversations with influential political figures, including discussions involving Cuba, nuclear weapons, or confidential government matters. It is an extraordinary story. Unfortunately, the evidence is far less extraordinary. No authenticated diary matching those descriptions has ever been produced for public examination. No verified inventory from her estate identifies such a notebook containing classified political conversations. Friends offered conflicting memories. Some believed Marilyn regularly wrote personal notes. Others insisted the famous diary had grown larger with every retelling. That pattern appears repeatedly throughout this mystery. A small possibility becomes a confident rumor. The rumor becomes accepted fact. Then historians spend decades trying to separate one from the other. There was another complication. Robert F. Kennedy, as Attorney General and the President's younger brother, Robert Kennedy occupied one of the most powerful positions in the country. Several witnesses later claimed he also knew Marilyn personally. Some alleged he visited her Brentwood home. Others strongly denied those accounts. Even today, respected biographies reach different conclusions about the extent of their acquaintance. The disagreements are not the result of carelessness. They're the result of incomplete evidence. Many participants never spoke publicly. Others gave interviews years later, when memories had inevitably faded. Some accounts contradicted statements made only months earlier. This uncertainty has frustrated generations of researchers. Yet one fact is beyond dispute. By the summer of 1962, rumors linking Marilyn Monroe to the Kennedy family had spread through Hollywood, political circles, and the national press. Most Americans still knew very little. Those closest to the story knew far more, and some wondered whether the growing whispers would eventually become impossible to contain. Marilyn herself rarely addressed the rumors directly. When she did, she usually dismissed questions with humor or changed the subject entirely, whether that reflected discretion, embarrassment, or a desire to protect others. No one can say with certainty. But as July turned into August, the gossip surrounding her private life became only one part of a much larger crisis. Her health was deteriorating. Her dependence on prescription medication worried friends. She was trying to rebuild a film career that many believed was finished. And behind the gates of her quiet Brentwood home, events were beginning to unfold that would soon eclipse every rumor that had come before. Within days, the conversation would no longer be about a possible affair. It would become a question that has haunted America for more than 6 decades. What really happened on the night Marilyn Monroe died? By the summer of 1962, Marilyn Monroe had become trapped inside a contradiction. To the world, she was untouchable. To herself, she often felt completely alone. Every magazine cover suggested she had everything a person could want: fame, beauty, money, recognition. Yet the people closest to her saw a woman trying desperately to regain control of a life that seemed to be slipping away. Her marriage to playwright Arthur Miller had ended only months earlier. Professionally, she was locked in a bitter dispute with 20th Century Fox after repeated absences from the set of Something's Got to Give. Studio executives complained that delays had cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Entertainment writers questioned whether Hollywood's biggest star had become impossible to insure. Headlines painted Marilyn as unreliable, but headlines rarely told the whole story. Behind the scenes, she had been dealing with chronic sinus infections, recurring gynecological problems, exhaustion, and years of severe insomnia. Doctors prescribed sleeping pills, sedatives, and pain medication, a common medical approach during the early 1960s, though one we now recognize carried enormous risks. Unlike today, physicians often worked independently. One doctor might prescribe medication without knowing exactly what another had already recommended. Marilyn trusted her doctors. She also depended on them. That dependence gradually became one of the most dangerous aspects of her life, yet even as newspapers questioned whether her career was over. Something remarkable was happening inside 20th Century Fox. The studio began changing its mind. Executives had dismissed Marilyn from Something's Got to Give in June. The decision made headlines across America, but replacing her proved nearly impossible. Public sympathy shifted toward Marilyn. Interest in the unfinished film actually increased. The studio quietly reopened negotiations. Internal discussions suggested she could return to the production under a new agreement with improved financial terms. Instead of fading away, Marilyn appeared ready for another comeback. Friends noticed the change almost immediately. Photographer George Barris spent several afternoons with Marilyn during the final weeks of her life, taking relaxed photographs on Santa Monica Beach and around Los Angeles. These weren't glamorous publicity shots. They were unusually natural. Marilyn laughed, walked barefoot through the sand, smiled without the carefully rehearsed poses that had defined much of her career. Between photographs, they talked. Barris later recalled conversations about future movies, possible vacations, redecorating her home, and ideas for rebuilding her public image. According to him, she wasn't speaking like someone preparing to leave the world. She was speaking like someone planning the next chapter. Historians treat those memories carefully because they were recorded years after the events. But they also acknowledge an important point. Multiple friends remembered Marilyn discussing the future. That doesn't eliminate the possibility of suicide. People experiencing emotional crises often continue making plans, but it complicates the simple narrative that she had abandoned hope entirely. Meanwhile, another kind of pressure surrounded her. Rumors, not just ordinary Hollywood gossip. Political rumors. Every few days, another columnist hinted that Marilyn had become unusually close to powerful men in Washington. Very few writers mentioned names directly. Those who did relied on anonymous sources and carefully chosen language. Editors understood the legal and political consequences of making accusations they could not prove. Still, whispers spread quickly through Hollywood. Some believed Marilyn had become emotionally attached to President Kennedy. Others insisted the relationship had already ended. A smaller group claimed Robert Kennedy had entered the picture. Again, evidence remained frustratingly incomplete. There are eyewitnesses who believed Robert Kennedy visited Marilyn during the summer of 1962. There are equally credible individuals who denied those visits entirely. No single document resolves the disagreement. The uncertainty has allowed speculation to flourish for more than 6 decades. What is historically documented is that Robert Kennedy traveled extensively during this period and remained deeply involved in national security issues as Attorney General. His movements have been reconstructed from schedules, testimony, and official records. Some dates align with later allegations, others do not. That is why responsible historians continue to debate the matter rather than declaring certainty. The mystery survives because the evidence refuses to settle into a single story. There was another reason the rumors became so explosive: America itself. The country was living through one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. The Berlin crisis had shaken Europe. Cuba remained a growing concern. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and President Kennedy were engaged in a tense geopolitical struggle that would soon lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Inside the White House, national security was paramount. Any personal vulnerability involving the president carried obvious political risks, not because every rumor was true, but because even false rumors could become weapons. That atmosphere explains why presidential aides often worked tirelessly to protect Kennedy's public image. It also explains why later conspiracy theories found such fertile ground. Whenever official records were incomplete, people filled the gaps themselves. As July turned into August, Marilyn stood at a crossroads. Professionally, there was renewed hope. Personally, there was increasing uncertainty. She remained surrounded by people who cared for her. Yet she also remained one of the loneliest celebrities in America. No one around her realized how little time remained. Within days, the story would leave Hollywood gossip columns forever. It would become a national tragedy, and every unanswered question would suddenly matter far more than anyone had imagined. The final weekend of Marilyn Monroe's life has been reconstructed countless times. Police investigators did it, journalists did it, biographers did it, congressional researchers did it. Each reached broadly similar conclusions, yet no two timelines are completely identical. That alone explains why the mystery has never disappeared. Friday, August the 3rd, 1962, Marilyn spent much of the day handling ordinary business. She made telephone calls. She met with people involved in her career. Friends later described her mood as relatively positive. Negotiations with 20th Century Fox appeared to be moving forward. There was every reason to believe she would soon return to work. The following morning, Saturday, August 4, began quietly. Housekeeper Eunice Murray was at the Brentwood home. Marilyn remained there for most of the day. Telephone records and witness statements confirm that she spoke with several people over the course of the afternoon and evening. One of those conversations was with photographer George Barris. Years later, Barris consistently described Marilyn as cheerful. She discussed another photo session. She talked about future projects. She even mentioned seeing him again soon. Whether every detail of that conversation remained perfectly accurate decades later is impossible to know. But Barris never changed his central memory. He believed Marilyn sounded hopeful. She also spoke with hairdresser Sidney Gilleroff. Other friends recalled brief conversations. Each account adds another small piece to the puzzle. Then came one of the most debated telephone calls in the entire case, Peter Lawford. According to Lawford's later recollections, he telephoned Marilyn during the evening after becoming concerned about her well-being. He claimed her voice sounded unusually slow and heavily medicated. He later recalled Marilyn ending the conversation with words that would echo through history. "Say goodbye to Pat. Say goodbye to Jack, and say goodbye to yourself, because you're a nice guy." It is an unforgettable quotation. But historians approach it carefully. Lawford gave multiple interviews over the years. Some details changed, some became more dramatic, others remained consistent. Researchers therefore treat the quotation as an important recollection rather than unquestionable fact. As evening approached, Marilyn also received a visit from her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson. According to Greenson's account, they spent time talking before he encouraged her to rest. He later stated that Marilyn appeared calmer when he left the house. Again, historians have little reason to doubt that the visit occurred. Medical records and witness testimony support it. What remains impossible to know is exactly how Marilyn felt after the door closed behind him. The house gradually grew quiet. Outside, Brentwood looked like any other peaceful Los Angeles neighborhood. No photographers crowded the gates, no reporters waited nearby. Nothing suggested that history was unfolding behind the walls of the modest home. Sometime after midnight, events become much more difficult to reconstruct. Housekeeper Eunice Murray later testified that she became concerned when she noticed light beneath Marilyn's bedroom door during the early hours of August 5. She knocked repeatedly. There was no answer. Unable to reach Marilyn, she contacted Dr. Greenson. The psychiatrist drove back to the house. Finding the bedroom door locked, he reportedly looked through a window before breaking the glass to enter. Inside, Marilyn Monroe lay face down across her bed. She was unresponsive. A telephone rested nearby. Several prescription medicine bottles sat on the bedside table. Emergency services were summoned. But there was nothing left to do. At 36 years old, one of the most famous women in the world had died. News spread with astonishing speed. Radio stations interrupted regular programming. Television anchors announced the story before sunrise. Sunday newspapers rushed out special editions. Within hours, millions of Americans were asking the same question: how could this have happened? The Los Angeles County coroner would eventually conclude that Marilyn Monroe died from acute barbiturate poisoning and classify the death as a probable suicide. For many observers, the conclusion appeared tragically consistent with her long struggle against insomnia, anxiety, and dependence on prescription medication. For others, it was only the beginning. Almost immediately, investigators, reporters, and private citizens began noticing small inconsistencies in witness statements, timelines, and recollections. None alone proved a crime. Together they ensured one thing: Marilyn Monroe's death would never become just another Hollywood tragedy. It would become one of the most debated investigations in American history. The investigation that refused to stay closed, the official investigation, concluded that Marilyn Monroe died from acute barbiturate poisoning and classified her death as a probable suicide. Yet almost immediately, questions began to surface. Some witnesses gave timelines that differed slightly in later interviews. The exact sequence of phone calls, the time authorities were notified, and the movements of several individuals became subjects of debate for decades. Declassified FBI files confirmed that Marilyn had been monitored because of some of her political associations, but they contain no evidence proving she was murdered or silenced. Subsequent reviews, including the 1982 investigation by the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, found no credible evidence of homicide and upheld the original conclusion. Even so, the unanswered questions ensured the case never truly disappeared. In the absence of definitive proof, speculation filled the gaps, transforming Marilyn Monroe's death from a tragic Hollywood loss into one of America's most enduring mysteries. In the decades following Marilyn Monroe's death, thousands of pages of government records, memoirs, police reports, and investigative books were examined in hopes of uncovering one final piece of evidence that would explain everything. It never appeared. Instead, each new release answered some questions while creating others. When portions of the FBI's files on Marilyn Monroe became public through the Freedom of Information Act, conspiracy theories exploded once again. Many expected the documents to reveal a political cover-up involving President John F. Kennedy or Attorney General Robert Kennedy. They didn't. The files confirmed that federal authorities had monitored Marilyn because several people in her social circle had previously attracted attention during the Cold War. Agents collected reports about her associations, travel, and acquaintances. But nowhere did the documents establish that Marilyn possessed classified government secrets or that officials believed she posed a national security threat. That distinction is important. Being watched by the FBI in the early 1960s was unusual. It was not proof of a conspiracy. The same pattern appeared when later investigations revisited her death. In 1982, after years of public pressure, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office conducted another review of the evidence. Investigators examined witness statements, forensic records, and allegations that had circulated for years. Their conclusion remained the same. No credible evidence supported the claim that Marilyn Monroe had been murdered. Still, the mystery refused to disappear. Part of the reason lies in human nature. We struggle to accept simple endings when extraordinary people are involved. Marilyn Monroe wasn't just another actress, she was a cultural icon. An accidental overdose or suicide felt too ordinary for someone whose life had seemed larger than reality itself. Another reason is that so many of the people connected to the story became legends in their own right. John F. Kennedy was assassinated just 15 months after Marilyn's death. Robert Kennedy was assassinated 6 years later. Peter Lawford spent the rest of his life answering questions about parties he wished the world had forgotten. Each tragedy deepened public fascination. Each unanswered question encouraged another theory. Books claimed missing diaries existed. Others described secret recordings. Some alleged hidden government operations. Yet despite decades of investigation, none of those extraordinary claims has been supported by evidence strong enough to convince mainstream historians. The real story is, in many ways, even more compelling. It reveals how power, celebrity, politics, and media can combine to create a mystery that survives long after the people involved are gone. Sometimes history isn't remembered because every question was answered. Sometimes it's remembered because the questions never stop. Why Marilyn Monroe still haunts Hollywood more than 60 years have passed since Marilyn Monroe's death. Hollywood has changed. America has changed. The Kennedy administration has become history. Yet Marilyn remains one of the most recognizable faces in the world. Every generation discovers her again. Not simply because of her films, but because her story still feels unfinished. She represents more than beauty. She represents vulnerability hidden beneath perfection. She reminds us that fame can protect an image while leaving the person behind it painfully exposed. For decades, filmmakers have returned to the Monroe-Kennedy story because it sits at the intersection of 3 subjects audiences never stop questioning: celebrity, power, secrets. Whether an affair lasted days, weeks, or only existed in part as later legend, it permanently changed how Americans viewed the relationship between Hollywood and Washington. It exposed how closely those worlds could overlap behind closed doors. It also demonstrated how easily rumor can become accepted history when evidence is incomplete. Today, historians continue to examine newly available records, private correspondence, and eyewitness testimony with the hope that another document may someday answer the remaining questions. Perhaps it will. Perhaps it never can. Some truths disappear with the people who lived them. What remains is the evidence, and the responsibility to separate that evidence from speculation. That may never satisfy everyone. But it is the closest history can come to justice. On the night Marilyn Monroe died, America lost far more than its biggest movie star. It lost the only person who truly knew every conversation, every relationship, and every private moment that had shaped the final months of her life. The rest has been left to investigators, historians, journalists, and generations of people searching for certainty in a story built on fragments. Did Marilyn Monroe have a relationship with President John F. Kennedy? Most historians believe some form of relationship likely existed. Was it the sweeping secret romance portrayed in popular culture? The evidence doesn't support that conclusion. Was she murdered because she knew dangerous political secrets? After decades of investigations, no credible evidence has proven it. Yet the questions endure because Marilyn Monroe became something larger than history itself. She became a symbol of an America where glamour could hide loneliness, where power could exist behind closed doors, and where some mysteries continue to captivate us, not because we know the answer, but because we never stopped asking the question. And perhaps that is why, all these decades later, Marilyn Monroe still haunts Hollywood, not as a conspiracy to be solved, but as a reminder that history is often most powerful where certainty ends.